tell you this is the first trip I've taken, other than driving to Minneapolis for a couple of events in a year and 2/3. And the reason I came here is I got an invitation to come to Berkeley. And I built my whole trip around that, because I've always wanted to speak here. And I want you to know that, you know, I'm from that era of the 60s when, I hope you're aware that we protested a few things, and particularly the war in Vietnam. And the #1 campus in the country for protesting is where I'm standing. #2 was University of Wisconsin-Madison. Right? Columbia was 3rd. So we always kind of took our cue from Berkeley, and frankly, it was a very important thing to protest that war, not only from the point of view of the horrible things that were happening to Americans, but the horrible things that were happening to the peoples there. And so I've always admired this place. And it turns out it's every bit as beautiful as Stanford. And I'm not actually teaching there now, but I did some, so it's good to be here. Yes, so I had a long political career, both in the Wisconsin State Senate for 10 years, the U.S. Senate for 18 years. But I'm a lawyer, and what I'm doing now is I'm president of a group called the American Constitution Society. You may have heard of the Federalist Society, which is a conservative group that sort of engineered everything that's happened with the federal courts. We were formed 20 years ago to basically have a progressive response to that. I think it's much more than that now. We have a network of 200 student chapters there at the law schools. They're not undergraduate. 50 lawyer chapters. And we advocate, actively work with other groups on everything from immigration policy to the death penalty to environmental issues, anything that has a legal bent to it. Of course, everything does. So this is what I'm doing now. I'm running this national organization, and that's my job now. But what we have decided, and the reason I was kind of excited to talk to you, is there is a crisis in the country right now, not with regard to the Congress and a lot of other things, but with regard to the United States Supreme Court. So I grew up in a time when the court, at least by people like me and my families, we really admired the Supreme Court. And here's why we particularly admired it. We weren't sure how they were going to decide anything. In other words, we thought maybe they'd look at the case and the facts and the law and listen to the argument and decide on that basis instead of being partisan. That's changed. And in fact, in my entire lifetime, this is really incredible because I'm 68 years old, there has never been a Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court appointed by a Democrat.
Wow.
But that doesn't mean, I mean, Lyndon Johnson tried, but he didn't get through, this guy. So, okay, but that doesn't mean the court's always been like it is now. In fact, the Chief Justice that many progressives most admire was a Republican from Bakersfield, California, Governor Earl Warren, Chief Justice Earl Warren, the famous Warren course. And you know, Justice Brennan was one of the most wonderful progressive justices, appointed by a Republican. On the other hand, Jack Kennedy, my hero as a 7-year-old and for most of my life, he appointed a guy named Byron Whizzer White. He was a famous athlete, very bright guy, but he was kind of a disappointment for a lot of us because he was kind of conservative. So the point is, the institution was on the level. It wasn't some kind of a phony, predetermined thing. And so when I talk about tonight, the fact that we need Supreme Court reform, the things I'm going to mention that we ought to do, that we need to do, I would have thought were horrific ideas, even just a few years ago. But what's happened? The right in this country has stolen the Supreme Court. Some people want to say it a little more delicately. If we say we want to add seats to the Supreme Court right now to try to deal with this problem, they say, well, you're packing the court. To which we should say, no, they already packed it. And how did they pack it? How did they pack it? They packed it by not following the normal rules and traditions of the United States Senate. So you know how the nomination process works. If you open up the Constitution, there's very little here. I'm not going to bore about this topic. There's actually very little here in general, but it's a pretty important thing. But you know, the entire judicial power of the United States comes from just one paragraph, really. And I can read it to you. Section 1, Article 3. The judicial power of the United States shall be vested in one Supreme Court, and in such inferior courts as Congress may from time to time ordain and establish. The judges both of the supreme and inferior courts shall hold their offices during good behavior, and it's spelled with I-O-U-R, and shall at stated times receive their services, etc. That's it. There is no requirement in here that there be lower courts. Of course they are, and they're critical. There is no requirement of that kind at all, and it's up to Congress and the President to make some of those determinations. Nonetheless, as you know, for many years, the idea was that there should be 9 justices and that they serve for life. So that's good behavior, but life is what that's been generally interpreted to mean. All right. This seemed to work fairly well, frankly, even under more conservative courts. I think most of us, I was on the Judiciary Committee for 16 years. We didn't like it when George Bush became president, when he didn't get the most votes, and so on and so forth, but we sort of accepted it. And I was on the Judiciary Committee for the process of nominating 4 of the current justices, 2 by Bush, 2 by Obama, and you know, I didn't like the process in a lot of ways, but it was nothing like what happened more recently. So what happened was 2 seats were stolen. First one was suddenly Justice Scalia surprisingly died. But it was almost a whole year left in President Obama's term. Under the Constitution, I can read you that provision, who gets to decide who's on the court? There's really only 2 that get to decide. The President gets to choose who he or she nominates, and the Senate has to confirm anybody who wants to be a Supreme Court justice. And it doesn't say it has to be by 2/3 or anything like that. It just can be by majority vote, which is the way it is now. That's it. Those are the people that are supposed to make the determination. When Scalia died, when Justice Scalia, one of the most famous conservative justices, died, President Obama had an absolute mandate, having been elected overwhelmingly, re-elected in 2012, to choose, or at least have his choice considered. And he appointed the man who is now Attorney General, Merrick Garland, and all those Republicans had already voted for him from the Court of Appeals. He was one of the most distinguished people in the country, and yet they refused to even give him a hearing. The longest delay that had ever occurred in American history before was for Justice Brandeis, who was one of the greatest justices of all time. That was 126 days. This was like almost a whole year. So they stole it, and that's how Gorsuch got on. Then there was a reverse steal, if you will. Sadly, many of us who are Jewish remember it was Rosh Hashanah Eve. We were having our dinner for the New Year, and all of a sudden this, my wife doesn't like it, I have my phone near me. All of a sudden, Justice Ginsburg has died. And we thought, how could they possibly jam this through right before an election? You know, it's unseemly. And yet they went ahead and abused the process in a reverse way to jam through Barrett before the election could even be held, and of course, the person who made the nomination didn't even win the election. So that's why we say something untoward has happened here. The norms of the Senate have been changed in a way that would have shocked, I think, anybody. And of course, Senator McConnell has led the charge on doing this. So what do we do about it? I'm disturbed that I have to even propose this. And I'm disturbed that we have to talk about these things, because there can be a partisan war that goes back and forth. But if we don't do something about this, and these people that they've appointed, these Trump people, are like 49, 50 years old. Okay, some of you were born, we were talking after 9/11, very young people. If this is the way it's going to be, some of those people are going to be there for 30 or 40 years. Think about it. Some of you may be in your 60s. And what I like to say is, you know, being in your 60s is not as bad as I thought it was. However, you don't want 40 years to go by when your generation does not have a mark on the law. So they've locked this thing down. They've locked your generation out, and so a radical response is basically required. And it's not just theoretical. Look what they're doing. Look what they're doing with this Texas thing. Using a process that is unforgivable. It's called a shadow docket. I'll talk about it in a minute. Using a process of not even having oral argument or a written opinion to stop a woman's right to choose after 50 years. Trying to strike down almost every gun regulation in the country under an extreme view of the Second Amendment. And gutting the voting rights of the American people, which has always been a bipartisan issue until the Shelby County decision in 2013. So this isn't like, hey, they might do bad stuff. They're doing bad stuff right now. I told you to put up a white sheet if I'm talking too long, and we're supposed to get to the moderating, but let me give you the three kinds of things that might be done. We at the American Constitution Society support not specific legislation because we're a nonprofit, but we support concepts and ideas that we think can help. One idea is to change the composition of the court. So there's 9 justices now, but there haven't always been 9 justices. And there's no requirement that there be 9 justices. There were 6 originally, then 7, it's gone back and forth. It's been 9 for a long time. But it does not require a constitutional amendment to add seats. And a number of people think we should add 2 seats or 4 seats to broaden this out and not have, and make up basically for what was done illicitly to fill those other seats. One idea I have is, oh, maybe we could create 2 temporary seats. In other words, make them for 18 years, 2 seats, and maybe people will start behaving again, and we could go back to just having 9 justices. Another thing you can do, and I don't want to get technical here because I know you guys aren't in law school, but we have these Court of Appeals judges and Court of Appeals judges are at the next level down, the 9th Circuit here. There's no reason why you couldn't have some of those people sit with the Supreme Court justices on certain panels to make the decision. So there's a whole number of ways that we could change the composition of the court so these same people who were put on there in a way that I thought was a crime are not running the show the whole time you're pursuing your career. A second possibility, which may require constitutional amendment, because it does say they have to be able to serve for good behavior, is to create term limits. I hate term limits for members of Congress. I always thought that was dumb. But look what's going on. You've got a person like Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, an American hero, who is sitting there, basically dying. Trying to hang on. This is untoward. And she was still very alert. That wasn't the problem. But it was untoward. I'm sure the founders did not really think that was appropriate. What's the reverse now? A very great justice, Stephen Breyer, his buddies, people like, progressives are saying, you gotta quit, man. Because something, we could lose control here. Well, it'd be much better if people knew how long they were going to serve and they could sort of plan for that. So people say maybe an 18-year term for a Supreme Court justice. They could continue as an appeals court judge or go on senior status. Other ideas are let's have every president get to pick 2 justices, kind of rotated. Second year, 4th year, and then you'd at least have turnover, and it wouldn't be a political war. Yes, it would matter who won for president. But it wouldn't be a game to see who could live longer and who could play more ruthless games in terms of the Senate confirmation. The third area where we can make change, and by the way, this one may require, the one I just said may require constitutional amendment. I'm not sure though, that absolutely sure that good behavior has to be viewed as a life tenure, but it's complicated. And one of the reasons that a lot of people are demanding more, adding seats, or something like that, is that a constitutional amendment would take a very long time, be very difficult. So the third possibility is simply reforming the institution itself. This won't be enough, but it would help. Look, they are using something called a shadow docket, which is supposed to be used like if there's a death penalty case. It's 11 o'clock at night. The guy's going to be executed at midnight. The Supreme Court has to quickly take up whether or not there's a problem there. That's what the shadow docket is for. They used it, though, to allow a situation in Texas where women can't get an abortion now. They didn't have an opinion. They didn't have any public hearing. So this shadow docket is being grossly abused, and it is time for the Congress to crack down on that. Another thing is, the justices in your state here and Court of Appeals justices, district justices, they have ethics rules. They can't go to political fundraisers, they can't do the various things, they have to recuse themselves in certain cases. The Supreme Court doesn't have that. they should have some ethics rules. There's a lot of information about the money that's flowing behind all this. And then the last thing I'll mention, and leave it at that, and then perhaps go to the next phase of this program, is goes to my experience in the Senate. So if you open up your Constitution again, it is brief, and that makes it kind of handy, is that the Senate and the House are entrusted with making their own rules. That's where the filibuster comes from. Even though you might think that a majority vote would be the rule, the Senate decided to have a system where they required more votes on certain legislation. However, each house, it says in section 5, each house may determine the rules of its proceedings. In other words, it makes its own rules. That means the Supreme Court's not going to say, oh, no, you can't have that rule. So I think, because of what we just described with Ginsburg and this, there should be a rule that says when the president has made a nomination, that it has to get a hearing and be considered by a certain date, and that you have to wait a certain period of time also. In other words, a minimum period and a maximum period. That would have prevented both of these things from happening. And it's a rule that the Senate would have to follow. So look, I don't know which one of these is necessarily the right thing. There's different views. And why am I talking to undergraduates about it? Because the Supreme Court is everybody's. Yeah. For people to think that this is just a lawyer thing is wrong. I hope many of you become lawyers. We need people like you to be lawyers. But every American should realize that when the Supreme Court of the United States has been beginning to be delegitimized by these tactics, our entire system is in danger. As one of the professors of our organization said to me, Russ, you need to learn how to talk about this a little bit differently. He says the Supreme Court is the protector of the guardrails of democracy. The guardrails of democracy, like voting. And when the Supreme Court doesn't do that, something's got to give. So that's the message I wanted to give you. I do hope some of you go to law school, but there's no reason for you not to engage in this outside of law school while you're undergraduates and in your careers. So with that, I understand I should sit down and be moderated, right?
Yes. What an excellent address. It definitely was very thought-provoking. And at this time, I'd like to welcome tonight's student moderator to the stage, Diane Chow.
Thank you so much, Mr. Feingold, for being here. It's a pleasure to have you at the forum.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, so to get started, some have argued that the Supreme Court has become increasingly partisan over the past decade. How, if at all, has this viewpoint become more ubiquitous?
I think people always thought sometimes that the court was, Republicans would do one thing and the Democrats would do another. I think the turning point, though, was actually the thing that started the American Constitution Society. It was the case of Bush v. Gore in 2000. And that was on partisan lines, and it was a very questionable decision that handed the election to Bush. That really started this sort of modern feeling that something was really partisan. And of course, there have been other decisions that were terrible, the Dred Scott decision and others, but in terms of partisanship, that started it. What probably put it into overdrive, though, is after President Obama succeeded in getting Obamacare, is that the court was asked to entertain ways to try to undo the legislation that were, even too much for this court. But basically, people kept voting on partisan lines on that instead of on the law. And so, and the third one was the one that certainly bothered me. The thing I'm most known for in my career is the co-author of the McCain-Feingold campaign finance law. And we got our bill approved, but then in 2010, there was a decision called Citizens United that struck down a 1907 law that Teddy Roosevelt signed that said corporations can't just pour money into campaign. And they just threw it out after 100 years, 100+ years. That was on partisan lines, And so those decisions have led to this decision, to this feeling, and now, after these three Trump judges are on, the way they're voting now, there is a strong feeling that somehow this has turned into a partisan body. There's no way the Supreme Court of the United States ever would have been given the right to strike down laws. They were given in the famous case of Marbury versus Madison in 1803. There is no way that that would have ever been given to that court if they thought that it was going to be like this.
And it has been historically understood that the Senate serves as a counterweight to the speedy legislation process of the House of Representatives. How, if at all, do you believe this definition has evolved in our current state of hyperpartisanship?
It's gotten really bad, and here's the weird thing. If you guys have probably been in organizations where you follow parliamentary procedure, Robert's Rules of Order, the normal thing in any legislative body in the world is to be able to move to call the previous question. It's a motion. All that means is, it's time to vote, guys. We've heard enough. Early in the history of our country, two vice presidents who you may have heard of, a guy named Thomas Jefferson and a guy named Aaron Burr. Who's that? They ruled from the chair of the United States Senate as vice presidents that you couldn't use that except for in exceptional circumstances. So basically, there was no limit on debate. However, it wasn't really a problem for 100 years. I mean, the Senate wasn't all tight. They would talk, you know, of course there was no TV or anything. You know, they would talk and then they'd vote. But the thing that led to this issue was actually a bunch of progressive senators, like one of my heroes, Fighting Bob LaFollette from Wisconsin, as we call him. They were trying to prevent us from going into World War I. But Woodrow Wilson really wanted to get us in there, and he was mad that they were filibustering. They kept talking. So they put in place this rule called cloture. Cloture is if you get 60 or 65 votes, you stop the debate. The problem is, though, that as this has evolved over the years, senators don't even have to speak. They don't have to stand up and actually do anything. They just say, oh, I'm filibustering. So Representative, James Clyburn, the guy that got Biden elected from South Carolina, he calls it the spa filibuster. That the people filibustering can be at a spa in Rio de Janeiro, and the filibuster is still working unless 60 of the party that want, or the people that want to do this, come. So this is how this process has been distorted, and it no longer reflects the original idea, which you stated correctly. The original idea is the Senate, would deliberate and sort of more carefully consider, and that's why they got 6-year terms and so on and so forth. That was the idea. But now it's been turned into a body that's just as partisan as the House. And that is not the way it was intended.
And as you just mentioned how these congressional dynamics have been changed over the years, how about has the executive branch, primarily the presidency, changed in this context?
The presidency has grown in power very, very dramatically over the history of our country. Not to say it wasn't powerful in the 19th century, but I think most people regard Theodore Roosevelt's presidency, who in many ways I admired because he was very progressive on the environment and campaign finance and other things. He was awful, but he asserted certain power, particularly the power to interject us into military operations. I can read you the sentence from the Constitution here. Under Article 1, only Congress has the power to declare war. But that's become a dead letter. And I think generally, historically, people believe, I can see you're nodding your, you've been taught well here, before, that in fact, it's been distorted into a sort of the power of the presidency to just go ahead and do whatever they want. Now here's part of the reason. It's not just the president's fault. It's Congress's fault for acquiescing. Why? Because if there's a war coming up, here's how it works. If you don't have to vote, and it goes well, you can go to the parades. You can welcome all the guys and gals back. If it doesn't go well, you can say, hey, I didn't vote for that. In other words, don't do your job. And then nobody's going to be able to blame you. So it is the fault both of the Congress. The aggrandizement by the executive, the acquiescence by the Congress. And stormed against this to very little avail. And now, of course, it got even worse under President Bush, under this unitary and Cheney, the unitary theory of the executive, which Trump believed meant he could do whatever he wanted. And of course, the leading theoretician behind that was a guy named John Yoo, who I believe might be a professor around. He's very smart, but he sure as heck advances a view of the executive that I think is totally unconstitutional.
That's deep.
And in terms of the role of constituencies, a Pew Research study found that only 28% of Americans can say that they trust the American government most of the time. What avenues, if any, exist to improve government trust among the American public?
That is such a hard question, and it's much harder to answer now than it ever has been in my lifetime. And we all know why. I walk around that Stanford campus and I think, you can either think of this as the Athens of, the place where this unbelievable change in humanity occurred and started in that area, or you can see it as Pandora's box, that this monster was unleashed. And I was excited about it. But, the fact that, I know you may find this kind of old guy talking, but look, when I was a kid, and I had homework, my mother said, "Have you done your homework?" And what do you have to do? I said, "I gotta write a report on Tunisia." Okay, you better go do it. All right, go downstairs, and there was a thing called the World Book. It was like an encyclopedia. And you open it up, and there was a paragraph about Tunisia. Copy it over, I'm done. This thing is to me like beyond belief. That I can look up anything in any language. That I can solve any argument with my wife about some facts. Sometimes winning, sometimes losing. So I had this sense of wonder about it. But after the 2016 election, it did not go well for me. I was asked by Stanford to come and teach a course on misinformation on the internet, and started grappling with what was going on at Facebook, Google, Twitter, even Reddit. We were studying that as well. I thought that was a very interesting example because of this, what do they call them, the subgroups? The subreddits. Well, I'm a Redditor. I had to sign up for it because I don't really do it very much, but I had to sign up for it so I could understand it. So the point is that for me to sit here and expound about how you deal with falsehoods is one of the most difficult, I think, overwhelming questions that we're going to face and that you're going to face. I really, is it by having antitrust laws that would break up some of these companies? I certainly don't think it's the government deciding what you can put on there or not. But it is really, really tough. And you're going to be struggling with this your whole life. The things we've had to struggle with our whole lives, race issues and others that continue. But this issue of information and falsehoods is really hard. And that's the best I got for you right now. But everybody's struggling with it.
And you mentioned the role of tech companies in misinformation. Some have argued that social media has led to an oversaturation of the marketplace of ideas. What role, if any, has the expansion of mass media had on the way our democracy functions?
I guess I don't really believe it's possible for there to be too much information. However, when there aren't alternative sources of information that are accessible or sort of locally based, I think you lose a significant balance. And this is where the loss of newspapers. And you may be too young to have even remembered what it was like to have that daily newspaper in your own town. And I don't mean the San Francisco Chronicle, I mean Janesville, Wisconsin, Beloit, Wisconsin. Each of those towns had its own independently owned paper. And often the paper did not even agree with the overwhelming politics within that town. They took pride in having their own editorial policy, and they were sort of like verifiers. They were sort of like truth tellers. They would say, Feingold is way too liberal. And we don't agree with him, and we didn't support him, but he's right on this one. And so all of this has been lost because of consolidation. And I voted against all these laws that consolidated the media. I tried to stop it. But we've lost the voices, the local voices. I live in a place called Middleton, Wisconsin. And we have two papers. And one of them's it's like a fine paper. But there's this kind of cranky guy who doesn't like it, and he runs around on a bicycle in town. He has this sort of counter newspaper. So whenever the mayor is doing X, Y, or Z, he lets him have it, makes fun of him. He says he's trying to become a king and all that. But it's journalism. And people, because everybody knows what's going on in the town, you can kind of make your own judgment. The way in which the internet is so overwhelming and that people are siloed and not in the same place with the same information, the same ideas, is a huge problem.
And, shifting gears to your work as the president of the American Constitution Society, some critics of term limits argue that implementing them may cause the Supreme Court to expedite or delay cases based on the political makeup of the court. How, if at all, may term limits affect the general logistics of the court?
That could be a problem, and I won't completely deny it. Of course, right now, they're delaying things or creating things based on whether they think somebody's gonna die. So, this can be gamed as well. Or they might be reading the polls and, people are retiring or not retiring based on what's gonna happen in presidential life. That really probably shouldn't be part of the process. So there will be political considerations either way, so I don't consider that decisive, but it's a fair point.
And you previously called for the American public to hold the Supreme Court more accountable. Surveys have currently shown that there's a lack of education around the Supreme Court's role in the Constitution, with just around 40% of Americans being unable to identify the Supreme Court as a part of the federal government. How, if at all, can the American public keep the Supreme Court accountable given this observed lack of knowledge?
Well, this is why we think we have to do these reforms, because the goal is that the Supreme Court be considered legitimate. And the only way to do that is to do something to make sure it doesn't look like it's an extension of a political party. And that goes to the left or the right. So, my goal isn't to sort of have, or our goal isn't sort of to have the Supreme Court be accountable per se. The Supreme Court should be able to look at cases and rule on the merits. But when it is using procedures and policies, and when it's constituted by people who weren't properly put on the court, then the things that led to that have to be held accountable. So that's why I talked about how the Senate rules can be reformed. But the goal here is to return, for me anyway, and for the American Constitution Society, is to return the Supreme Court to a body that people can respect and trust. And then, then you have to fight and see if you can get your guy or gal elected president. And then they get to pick the justices. You get to decide, figure out who's got the majority in the Senate. But I would love to see us get back to where we were in the early years when I was in the Senate, where pretty much if somebody was appointed to the Supreme Court and they were qualified, they were supposed to get approved. It should not be a bitter partisan war.
And going further into the role of the Constitution, the Federalist Society, an originalist and textualist organization, has had immense influence over American law, with 6 out of 9 Supreme Court justices having ties to them. As someone who has long challenged textualism, what is your approach to combating the cultural influence it has over our legal system?
Well, let's be clear about what originalism and textualism are. Sounds like kind of fancy, but it really isn't. It isn't really that hard to understand. You probably already know as undergraduate, I wouldn't expect you to. Basically what the conservatives put out there was this idea that whatever the Constitution, whatever was originally intended by the founders, should be the way you interpret the Constitution. And then some people would say, well, we can't really tell for sure what was intended, because the truth is the only record was, the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia was a secret proceeding. And the only record is James Madison's notes, which were not complete, they're important. So they say, well, all right, then you should look at the text. You should say, what does it say? And they say, well, and they say, and what you should do is look at what those words meant in 1789. So, like the right to bear arms. What did arms mean? What did bearing arms mean? So those are the ideas. And, you know, that has appealed to people, to some people. They say, look, yeah, of course, this is the Constitution, it was ratified, that's what you should do. But then you go, wait a minute, who was in that room? No women, no African Americans, no Native Americans. Well, how can a docket created that way be interpreted 200 years later without considering the fact that it is as we call it in our organization this year, this is our 20th anniversary, the founding failures of the Constitution. If this document is not interpreted in the context of this country in the 21st century and our diverse country, it loses its credibility. And so I think any good lawyer should look at what they think maybe was originally intended, what the text might mean, but also what it has to be adapted to make it apply to the world that you all are going to live in. Now here's one other problem. These conservatives in the Federalist Society don't really use originals and textualism. It doesn't produce the result they want. So you look at the 8th Amendment. What does it say? It says there shall be no cruel and unusual punishment. So what do they say? Well, in 1789 there was a death penalty, so they must not have considered that cruel and unusual punishment. They could have said that. They could have said the death penalty is fine. They didn't. They said cruel and unusual punishment. And I believe that's an invitation to those of us in the 21st century to ask, what is considered cruel and unusual punishment in our world now? That's what I think they were doing. And overwhelmingly, in this world, the death penalty is rejected, and now for the first time ever, and I've always been proud as a Wisconsinite that the only 2 states that didn't have the death penalty when I was growing up were Wisconsin and Michigan. We haven't had an execution since the 1850s. Now, a majority of the states in the United States have either abolished the death penalty or there is a moratorium or the court has said. So I think, you know, if you're really an originalist, you can't say, well, this means you can never look at the language. And I think another thing is in the 4th Amendment. There shall be no unreasonable searches and seizures. Okay, what does that mean today? Well, it doesn't mean just coming into your house. It means going into this thing. They could have said, you can't go into people's house without a search warrant. That isn't what they said. They were smart enough to do so. That's just a little illustration of kind of the manipulation that they use on this thing. Don't get me going on this.
And you mentioned how there was a lack of consideration of diversity when the Constitution was written. One of the missions of the American Constitution Society is to build a diverse and dynamic group of people committed to justice. What is the social impact of increasing minority representation in the legal and political field?
Well, it's overwhelming. I mean, if you go into court as a criminal defendant or a consumer, and the judges none of the judges look like you or have anything, have any relationship to your background, it kind of doesn't feel right, and it isn't right. And the other thing is, if none of the judges have had experience outside of being prosecutors or corporate lawyers, and none of them have represented unions or consumers or been public defenders, this is very distorted. So what we have done through the American Constitution Society, we're very proud of it. In the last 2 years, we've created this network around the country, and we recommended 400 people to be judges by talking to the community. So here in California, there's 4 groups in 4 parts of the state, and our lawyers started it, but they went to the Latinx community, they went to the Black community, they went to the LGBTQ community, they went to the unions, and they said, who do you think should be judged? So I'm proud to say that 4 days after Joe Biden was declared, as the day he was declared the mayor, within 2 hours, we had 400 names, and now you've got to give credit to Biden's administration. They are at a record pace, not only ahead of every administration since Nixon in terms of numbers, but the diversity of the judges that have been confirmed. 3 African American women already confirmed this year as Court of Appeals. A Latinx woman was put on the 2nd Circuit this week. Mina Perez was a marvelous person. And a huge percentage of the people he has appointed and who are moving through the process have been public defenders. And so, you know, this is something he should be given credit for. I don't agree with everything they're doing, and we are not supporters of the Biden administration, but on this one, they are performing, and they are changing the face of the judiciary. If it needs to continue, whether or not it will continue will depend on, you know, obviously what happens in 2022, 2024, because enormous damage was done under the previous administration.
Thank you for a thoughtful response, and for the sake of time, this will be my last question. What is your favorite subreddit?
Favorite what?
Subreddit.
Oh, subreddit. It's just the general news one. Whatever that was. First of all, I know it's a dangerous question. that much I know. But it's just like, okay. And the ones with the scenes of nature. What is that called?
Ours. The crunchy, the granolas. No.
Yeah, just, I'm working on this campaign for nature about the biodiversity crisis. I just love looking at that, but stay away from this one.
Yes, and thank you so much for answering my questions. We can now move on to the Q&A section with the audience. If you would like to ask a question, please raise your hand and I'll call on you. Yes?
So your successor in the Senate, Ron Johnson, who is known as an insurrectionist apologist and COVID denier, among other things, his term expires next year, right? And he's been rumored to not be seeking re-election. So I'm curious what you think the best strategy would be for the Wisconsin Democratic Party to reclaim that seat.
You have picked a question that I am not allowed to answer.
Oh!
Here's why. Because I run a 501c3, which means it's a nonprofit. You can imagine I have certain feelings and thoughts about this, but I am not allowed to advise or get involved, which is weird for me after all these years, in Democratic politics. But I can certainly point you to people who can talk to you. But thank you for the question. It's a fair question.
Yes?
So I have two questions. My first question is, can I take a selfie with you?
Yes.
Maybe
Okay,
after.
and then my second question is, I just want to premise by saying thank you. Like this is literally like a dream come true. I feel like I'm at Disneyland even more now for college. But my question is so this COVID plague won 2/3 year. Fun fact, it started on the embarkment of my 19th birthday. On March 12th, I woke up to an email saying COVID was a thing and it left me feeling miserable. And now I'm doing a little bit better, still a little bit sad because I'm at Berkeley, but how do you think, it's a little hard, I get burnt out a little bit, but Senator, I'm curious how do you think that COVID-19 and the aftermath of COVID-19 will affect us for the rest of our lives in politics, in culture, our mental health, and everything in between?
Well, I think it's impossible to know the range of ramifications. They're unlimited. But, you know, I gotta figure out how I say this, but I've learned more about the economy of the country and the world because of COVID than I ever thought I would. You know, just, you know, these shortages, the shipping, all the things that, the fact that people are deciding they don't necessarily want to go back to work. The fact that they've realized, you know, how much was I really making at that restaurant? I can be with my kids. I can maybe get a job online. So it's going to transform the world of work. It already is, which is one of the most dramatic things. I hope that it makes people realize that having an effective government is a good thing. That being anti-government completely is stupid. That you need to have a functioning government to fight something like this. This will not be the only crisis of this kind. You know, I did a lot of work in Africa, HIV/AIDS, the Ebola crisis, and others, and possibly this one, were a result of what's called the Zoonotic Effect, which is from wild animals. A bat might, you know, eat let's say a monkey in Africa eats a bat, which has got Ebola, and it doesn't affect the bat, and it doesn't affect the monkey. But when that monkey goes into the market and the human being eats it, then it's transferred. One of the views is this was from the pendulum, that this is what happened, is that in China there were some of these pendulum animals. So we have to recognize that the impact on the environment, the disturbing of wild places, can cause these things to happen. And of course, we're always going to have some contact. But, so the ramifications are enormous. And I also expect there'll be an awful lot of people interested in health and public health as a result of this. You know, it's just like after 9/11, everybody wanted to, not everybody, but an awful lot of people wanted to go into intelligence and CIA and all this. This will be I assume so many of your generation will be interested in this because it affects everybody. Finally, let me just say, sorry, I hope it ultimately makes people think of us all as one place. You know, the Pope talks about protecting our common home. You know, think of us as humanity, because this is the only thing in my lifetime that affected everybody in the world. And so maybe it can be a foundation for some kind of different attitude.
Thank you. Thank you, Senator. You're a real G.
We have time for one more question. I saw your hand for a while.
Yeah. So you had recommended that everyone here, for example, go to law school, and we are also.
Well, I don't know for everybody. I hope some of you.
But you said you hope that some of us go to law school. I mean, in light of the fact that this country faces, like, you know, existential threats from climate change, there's economic problems, there's health problems, why specifically do you think law school is a good solution?
Because every one of those problems, every person that works on those problems needs good lawyers to help them. I guarantee you. Because this is such a litigious society, people like to litigate. Okay? If there aren't people trained in the environmental issues, trained in the healthcare issues, to handle the legal aspects of it, it can be devastating for what you're trying to accomplish. Shakespeare did say, first let's kill all the lawyers, but I think that was short-sighted. So you need them. You need some lawyers. And that's what we're trying to do.
Yeah, so that's all the time that we have. Thank you so much once again for answering all
A lot of
our
fun,
questions.
great attendance. Thank you.
I'd like to now pass it over to our president, Owatara, for closing remarks.
Sorry, my laptop went to sleep. Okay. Waiting for it to connect, but while that connects, at every single one of our events, we like to thank our speakers for coming, and today is no different. So one of our members of our marketing team had made this beautiful poster for you, and we framed it.
Oh, how
And
nice. Thank
yeah,
you
we're
so
super
much.
excited for you to have Today's poster was made by Ani, one of our newest members. It's beautiful, it's so cute.
Nicely done.
Every event, there's several people working behind the scenes, and I'd like to thank these people, our event managers, Anna and Emma, our communications lead, Flora, our finance lead, Nakash, the poster designer, Ani, and of course, our wonderful moderator for tonight, Diane. If you'd like to continue to engage with our events, we actually have one tomorrow that'll be taking place on Zoom, Facebook, and YouTube with Sarah Ramos. She's an actress, and on a note, she's like talking about videos. I think it's gonna be really interactive. I think y'all should come on out. We love feedback. We love iterating. So if you'd like to give us a feedback on any of the things that we did tonight, please feel free to fill out our tinyurl.com/tbffeedbackf21 or scan this QR code here. Remember to like us on Facebook and visit our website. And with that, I'm really glad that we were able to, embark on this great conversation today. Super thankful for you again. So let's give one more round of applause.